is going to be our guest tonight on Soapbox. I'm Jeannie Keltner. I'm welcoming you to the show. We will be talking with Todd about his campaign for DA, District Attorney, and what that means. Just number one, to know what it means to have a district attorney that you trust and honor. But first of all, we always like to thank the people who help us do this show, beyond those wonderful crew that is always here. First of all, there's Pieces Pizza. Pieces Pizza is on 21st Street between M and N, and the wonderful pizza that we eat on this show comes from Pieces, and they sell it by the slice. They stuff the crust. I find it the most delicious pizza in town, and we say that the crew works for peace and it works for pizza, and that's all they work for. They're wonderful volunteers, and we have to thank them every time. The next person I like to thank is James Israel, who puts out the Humor Times. For as long as we've been doing this program, James has been doing the Humor Times. HumorTimes.com, you can subscribe to it used to be called the Comic Press. It's filled with political cartoons that will make you laugh at the most idiotic things that are happening in our government. If you stay tuned, let's go next. Stay tuned. After this show, you can hear Nahid Kabani's show Lighthouse for today's viewers. It often deals with issues from the Middle East that you do not hear covered in any meaningful way in the commercial media. And one of the great shows on Access is a 2-hour show called Media Edge that both records wonderful speakers who come to town and also has lots of interesting video on progressive issues. So it's on Sunday nights at 8. Other than that, I want you to tune in to KVMR up in Nevada City this coming Wednesday. I will be talking with Allison Weir on the Undernews, and Allison Weir runs a website called If Americans Knew, with lots of information about Israel and Israel's actions in the West Bank, in the occupied territories, that is just never surfaces in our press. And she has recently come back from putting on a day-long seminar with panels, etc., in Los Angeles at the Press Club called Reevaluating the Israeli-U.S. Relationship, that gives you many ideas that you, again, certainly would not have heard about in our mainstream media. So tune in at noon, KVMR 89.5. If you can't get it on your radio, get it on your computer. We'll come in right after the BBC News. So I'm very pleased to have Todd Leras with us today, and running for district attorney.
Yes.
And the ACLU sent around, I'm a card-carrying member, you know how bad that is. I really don't support the ACLU, I support the National Lawyers Guild, which is much more radical. But the ACLU did say, what a difference a DA makes. And I started to think most people don't really think about why we need to consider carefully who we choose as a DA.
That's correct.
So what kinds of differences can a DA make?
DA makes an enormous difference in criminal justice enforcement, primarily because the DA sets the tone for how the criminal law is going to be enforced in the county where the DA sits. And that ranges from what charges are filed as misdemeanors, what are filed as felonies, because many charges can be filed one way or the other. They're called wobblers. And a wobbler can be charged either in the DA's discretion as a felony or as a misdemeanor. And the DA sets the tone in how it charges, also in how it tries to resolve cases. And I'll just elaborate a little bit on that, why it makes a difference.
I mean, all of this needs elaboration because luckily most of us don't have run-ins with the criminal justice system, but we are all connected to people who have had run-ins with the criminal justice system.
Absolutely. Family members, extended family members, it happens over and over again. And what you see happening is DA's offices will charge cases that should be treated as misdemeanors, or ultimately they intend to treat as misdemeanors as felonies in order to essentially, for lack of a better way of putting it, coerce a plea bargain, which is we will give you a misdemeanor to settle the case, and that's really what it should be, but we're going to charge it as a felony so that if you decide you want to exercise your constitutional right to a trial, you're going to be doing it on a felony charge. And the only thing that stands in the way from the DA making that decision is the judge. And many times the judge will defer to the DA, but there are unusual situations. I can tell you from my own personal experience, I started out not as a prosecutor but as a defense attorney. And I was a public defender here in Sacramento.
Wow, see, that's very important as a background in law.
I think so.
Very important.
I said years ago, and I still believe this, that everyone should have to try both sides. I think one of the most dangerous things that you can have in the criminal justice system is a person who views criminal law from only one view. It's the same, quite frankly, there are true believer defense attorneys who I think can lose their perspective on what's an appropriate resolution for a case, and at the same time you have the same thing with true believer DAs who could never envision doing defense work. And let's face it, defense work protects our constitutional rights. So when you're looking at that situation, one of the things that I'm mindful of is that it seems to me to be very wrong to take someone who's never been in trouble before and is relatively low level in terms of what they've done and force them to make a decision about whether they want to go to trial on a felony or whether they can take a misdemeanor.
Cop a plea.
Yeah, and I've seen that.
In the lingo of TV.
That's exactly right.
Right.
And I tell the stories about how uneven the enforcement of the law is in this county and in other counties, and people are frequently shocked.
What do you mean by that?
Well, let me give you a good example. I can't mention any names, obviously, but I'm doing some civil and criminal law because I had to leave my job as a federal prosecutor in order to run for DA, because federal prosecutors aren't allowed to run for political positions. Unlike the AG, the Deputy AG, Maggie Krell, and the sitting supervising Deputy District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert, they could stay in place. I couldn't. But what I've done is I'm doing some criminal law work, and I've noticed, for example, one of the first clients I had was a young woman who came in, no record, relatively minor embezzlement case in the sense of $3,000 from an employer that's significant, large, and the offer to her initially was a felony, 180 days. Okay, she was 18 when the crime was committed. No record, college student, employed, and then I turned around and one of my colleagues comes to me and says, "Hey, what do you think of this offer? We've got a guy possessing a firearm, he has a prior sex offense, and he gets a 180-day felony offer." Okay?
Same deal.
Same deal, totally different situation.
One is a real danger to the community,
yes,
at least armed.
Yes.
And the other is 18, for crying out loud.
And it is a property crime only. And that's what I'm talking about, that the DA has to set the tone from the very top. And right now in this county, what's happened for 20 years is the tone within the office is one where if you want to advance in the DA's office, and I know this because I was there for 13 years, you essentially have to posture that you are tough on crime, that you have no mercy, that you really want to stick it to the criminals. And that's generally, by the younger prosecutors, considered the way to advance and get promotions and get plum assignments. There are exceptions, but generally that's the environment. And that comes from the top down, that people perceive that's what you want me to be. And if I'm going to do justice, which is really the ultimate thing a DA is going to do, I have to do it quietly and when no one's looking.
I'm ashamed of my work for justice. The reason I was really eager to have Todd Leras on the show is that I read a quote from him that said, "The business of a DA is not to pile up convictions, but to do justice." And there's a real difference, just as these two cases that you mentioned. I mean, would it be justice to call this young 18-year-old, to get her into prison for a few years, ruin her life, ruin the lives of the people around her?
No, and I think the voters have recognized this, that look, we live in a time, quite frankly, that's wonderful in the criminal justice arena, in that people have grown tired of the same old tough on crime approach to non-violent low-level offenders. Right. They really do want to put away, and I agree with them, I understand this completely, the predators, the murderers, the rapists, they're truly dangerous. But
the bankers? Oh, sorry, that just slipped out.
But there is this emphasis on, all right, we have very few bed spaces in the state prison system, and they're being ordered by the federal courts to diminish the prison population. So we really have to emphasize and prioritize putting the truly dangerous there. So what do we do with the nonviolent people who commit lower level offenses or drug offenses? This is a wonderful opportunity for us to say, no, the job that the DA has is no longer just to try to put them in jail. We don't have the space anymore. Let's try and fix the problem. Let's actually use some of the money that we're starting to see come in terms of revenue and that's being sent from the state to deal with this realignment issue, and let's see what programs work in getting people off of drug addiction, getting them working, and trying to make sure that the crime rate decreases.
But getting people working is easier said than done, unfortunately, because to my mind, we have several things affecting our attitude toward crime. One is unemployment, which is huge. The other is drug situations, which is also huge. And I'm a total advocate of legalizing marijuana in every single way possible. Personally, because I've said on this show many a time, I have smoked marijuana every day of my life for 50 years. I have a PhD, I have 2 successful kids, I have lots of friends, I have a life, etc. So I think I stand as a witness to the fact that it is not a gateway drug to anything. And it has ruined life after life after life, especially if you're poor, black, or Mexican. Those are the people who just get sent up the river around dumb offenses with drugs.
Well, and we see that with drug offenses. What ends up happening, I guess this is where my experience as a federal prosecutor comes in, because we were focusing in our investigations and in our efforts on major drug dealers of poison, methamphetamine, crack cocaine. And unfortunately, because the state has botched marijuana so badly, and no one really knows what marijuana laws are in California. I think
tricky.
It's very tricky.
I just announced myself as a convicted felon, not a convicted, or a possible felon. So.
Well, I think what you're talking about, you're fine. But I know that many people feel the way you do and want to see marijuana legalized, and certainly that's something that the voters should be considering in the next few years. And the DA's job is really to enforce the laws that exist. That's what I'm talking about in terms of the problem. It was very easy for me as a federal prosecutor to see, all right, what are we talking about? Who is it we would target in terms of marijuana offenses? And unfortunately, it became too big a part of our caseloads because of what the state had done. And it really is someone who's growing indoors, usually more than 100 plants, stealing power, hiding their activities, doing something dangerous. And those people, quite frankly, if it were legal, I've heard the argument, and you can see some merit to the argument, that there would be less of a target on their back for rip-offs and other things. And I know people make that argument. And then for outdoor grows, we were generally looking at people who are growing more than 1,000 plants. So we're not talking about small user quantities, but major quantities. Those are the kinds of cases we looked at, but they became a disproportionate part of our caseload.
A ridiculous part, because they were really victimless crimes in many ways.
Right, and we had DEA agents who stopped investigating methamphetamine cases altogether and were chasing after marijuana. It was very frustrating for the prosecutors at the line level.
I can certainly imagine.
Right, and so, I mean, the fact of the matter is what the DA should be doing, and again, this is another way a DA makes a difference, is focusing on the higher level drug dealers of methamphetamine, crack cocaine, the drugs that we really see doing.
The drugs that ruin lives.
Absolutely.
Right, because that is not a victimless crime.
If you take a look at someone who has abused methamphetamine, if, for example, you said, well, I've smoked marijuana on a daily basis for the last 50 years, okay? If you told me you were using methamphetamine every day, I wouldn't expect you to be here.
I wouldn't have teeth.
Right, exactly.
I'd have little patches of hair growing out. I rented to methamphetamine users, not knowing, of course. So it came as quite a shock.
And
and the funny thing, Todd, is it's the unintended consequences that the rational mind really doesn't ever see truly the unintended consequences. But the unintended consequences of really cracking down on marijuana led to the rise of methamphetamines.
That's true.
And the unintended consequences of bombing Afghanistan back to the Stone Age led to the rise in heroin addiction all across the United States. It's funny how much we're implicit in crime because we can't use our heads to see the whole picture. you know.
We were really seeing that. As I said, our caseloads in the U.S. Attorney's Office before I left were composed of way too many marijuana cases, and not
too easy to prosecute.
Exactly. And then we saw heroin start to take a rise right around the time I left, and people hadn't seen heroin cases for quite a while, as you said.
Well, we have that whole poppy cultivation scene in Afghanistan that is heartbreaking.
That's
You know,
exactly right.
we have U.S. soldiers guarding poppy fields. Oh, sad, sad. Okay, other ways that a DA makes a difference. I think it's very important that people realize that the way you define the crime, whether it's a felony or a misdemeanor, is hugely important. And in the ACLU paper, there was a case of a woman, again, there was very little evidence against her, and she was caught, she was a friend of a drug dealer. Not a good choice right there. But they wanted her to to cop a plea and plead guilty to a misdemeanor and possibly get a felony record. And I mean, see, I'm not a lawyer and I can't remember details, but anyway, he offered her a terrible choice: plead guilty to the charges and go home a convicted felon, or remain in prison, fight the charges, and jeopardize custody of her daughters. So she had already been, she was caught up in a drug sweep, but she ended up in prison before she was charged.
That story is one that you see repeated over and over again. And that is a way that a DA can make a tremendous difference from the top in terms of the message that's communicated to deputy DAs, the people who are actually on the line enforcing cases. I can tell you tales of woe that I've seen over the years in my various capacities of people who were caught up for the very same reason, that they ended up being involved in a relationship with a drug dealer. I remember one lady in particular, and I won't mention her name, but I actually prosecuted her. I inherited the case from someone else, and it turned out that she should have never been charged in the first place. And I was able to do the right thing, which is get rid of the case as to her. Her boyfriend, who was a terrible crack dealer, was sentenced appropriately and stiffly. I mean, he was a bad guy.
That's a different story.
But from the very beginning, it was very clear that she had been a victim of domestic abuse at his hands. She had asked him to remove crack cocaine, his business, from her place, and the response was that he beat her severely. And yet she ended up getting charged. And many times you will see DAs who will take a hard-nosed position. Well, she knew. She let him use the house. You can't tell me she wasn't profiting. In this particular case, this person was one who I took the time to actually bring into the office with her attorney, meet with her, talk to her, assess her myself, and she convinced me not only that she didn't know, but that she was also truthful about what had happened in terms of being beaten. And also she was able to tell me about her son, who was 9 years old and living with her and wouldn't have anybody. It's a tremendous thing to have the ability and the power and also the approval of the upper echelons of a DA's office to do the right thing.
To go case by case.
Yes.
And not just tout up the convictions.
And that message has to be sent, and it starts from the top, as I've said.
This is Todd Leras that I'm talking to, who is running for DA. We are lucky to get a choice to vote for somebody who has a humane approach to criminal justice. Because the criminal justice system, I've taught in the prisons. I've spent 60 hours teaching in the prisons. I can't see how prison time can help many people. That's the other thing. I mean, if we had any kind of rehabilitation thing going, might be different, but.
And we saw that, you know, it's odd when you hang around long enough to where you start to get a little gray hair on the sides.
Yes.
You can see the pendulum start to swing, and it really is. This is a pivotal election, and the reason is I say that is I was here 20 years ago when Steve White, the incumbent DA, was challenged by Jan Scully when she came in, and at that time people were really fed up with crime. It was right around the time, just before 3 strikes and the terrible polyclass situation, and people essentially, you know, wanting to wash their hands of repeat offenders. And that's an understandable feeling, that people say enough is enough, and at a certain point, really you've proven that you're not going to rehabilitate. I agree with that assessment about various people, and I understand why people feel that way. Again, we're now in this whole new different era.
So you think things have really changed? Mindset is changing.
I see it. I see people who I talk to on a daily basis saying, we want the DA and law enforcement to try to do things to stop crime. And if we have a 70% repeat offender rate using a tough on crime strategy, and that's success, I don't want to see failure, right?
It's quite exactly.
So what we're really looking at is, I've called it a seismic shift in the way people view crime. I think people really do want us to try to address things, and I've talked about this, about trying to take a more proactive approach. Generally, when we put people on probation, we tell them, you better do certain things or the consequence will be you're going to get jail time. We've suspended jail time. That's what probation means. And if you don't do what you're supposed to do, if you don't test clean for drugs, if you don't show up for meetings, if you commit a new offense, we're going to throw you in the slammer. That's been the approach.
Right.
We've never taken
the punitive.
Exactly. I've never seen someone take a different approach, and it certainly could be tried, and it should be tried, where you say, look, if you go and you get your GED, we're going to reduce the time that's suspended. If you go and you get a job training program and complete it and show us a certificate, we'll do the same thing. In other words, we'll reward some of the positive behaviors we want to see in you and in your life.
So the probation doesn't mean the end of your life, because I do know people who have been thrown back, for such minor things. Do you know what I mean? An open can of beer in your car can get you thrown back.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
You're seeing less of that now because there's no room. There's just no room at the inn. But for a while there, when there was, in the 80s, there was this big building boom of these prisons.
Private prisons.
Well, private prisons are a terrible idea.
Terrible idea.
A terrible idea.
I mean, to make money out of throwing people in jail and then to want more convictions. And is it true in California that the private prisons want the state to pay them if they have empty beds?
Yes. Yes. The idea is, we've got to make a minimum amount of money in order to make this a go. And so we've got the beds, we've built it, so you should come. And if you don't, you should subsidize it. Well, we see the same thing with schools doing this, in terms of enrollment and having spaces.
Well, that's a little different.
Oh, totally different.
Because, I mean, schools aren't always positive in a kid's life, but prisons are rarely positive.
That's exactly right. And the reason I think people don't understand what a terrible idea private prisons are is that, look, once you privatize something, the whole purpose is to make money.
Yeah.
And there is no political pressure to treat prisoners better.
Because you want them back.
Well,
or you don't want to lose them.
The fact of the matter is that no one wants to hear a prisoner complain. I understand that people have that point of view. They really have no sympathy for people who have been sentenced. But they change their mind completely, and I've seen this, when it's their family member on the other end of the glass.
Oh, ain't that so?
Right, and suddenly it's an eye-opening experience, and now they want fair treatment, and they want people to have rights. And really the federal courts were the entity that stepped in California and said, look, state, you just keep piling bodies in here. You're reaching 175% of capacity. You can't care for these people appropriately. You can't give them appropriate medical and dental care. You're really just warehousing, and so you've got to reduce the population. That's what created this new environment that I think is so promising for the next DA to try some solutions, to look for solutions.
Well, I am very impressed with your attitude toward the whole process, because it's a problem-solving rather than problem-creating solution. You don't solve a problem by hiding it in a brick building somewhere.
No, that problem just sits there.
Festers.
And, again, the value of having been on the other side, and particularly very early in my career, when I was a new and young public defender, and I was significantly younger back then.
Well, that's always the case, the past. We were much younger.
Yes. The one thing that I think scared me the most when I represented younger clients was when they lost their fear of going in custody. Mm-hmm. When they still had that fear, and it was an unknown thing for them, and they didn't know what they were going to be facing, it gave you a lot of ability to sort of talk them straight. Mm-hmm. When you would see it, it was tragic. When they would go in and they would realize, I can do this, it's just time, I can get through it, nothing really terrible is going to happen to me, and they came out, you just saw, I've lost that person.
Well, you know, I would say in the Black and Mexican community, Latino community, there are many places where going to prison is just part of your growing up experience.
Right.
This is bad. And I've seen the statistics are incredible because, for example, drug use is about the same between Black, white, and Mexican populations, just about the same. But at every step of the judicial process, darker-skinned people get worse. They get charged more often, they get convicted more often, they get harder terms, so that their communities are ravaged by this whole process. Because, as you know, it's not just one person who goes to prison. The whole family is punished.
I've heard that so much. The best part about undertaking this whole process of running for DA has been the ability to go out in the community and meet community leaders, particularly of the groups, the Latino leaders and the African American leaders, to talk to them and hear how seriously they take the issue of crime. There's this view by some that you'll hear voiced that the communities don't care. That is absolute nonsense. They care desperately for many reasons. Number one, they care about what's happening to the young people and what direction they're going. We don't want to throw away whole members of society. And number two, remember, these crimes are occurring in their neighborhoods, and so it impacts them on a daily basis. So I've talked to these wonderful religious leaders and community leaders, and that's the first thing they say is, how do we stop this? What do we do to stop this? And they've told me their frustration over and over again at what's happening with the DA's office right now. When I first go in and I talk to them and I tell them what I'm running for and that I used to work in the DA's office, I've seen, and there's been some extreme examples of this, almost this hardening of the look.
Oh
and
yeah,
the stare down.
You're the enemy.
And then once I start talking about my ideas, you can see, oh, wait a minute, he wants to hear what we have to say about how to solve this. And Jeannie, that's the most important thing about this whole thing. If I had the answers, I wouldn't be where I am right now. I don't know the answers.
We're in a very complicated situation. Folks, I'm talking with Todd Leras, who is running for DA. We're going to take a short break, and in our short break, we're going to have a little public service announcement. Are they ready in there? Oops, wait. Wrong side. Todd Leras is my choice for district attorney because he's a thoughtful prosecutor. I'd love to see him in office. Even though I only like the candidates that the B does not endorse, because the B has been my enemy through this whole arena deal. I never thought the B could sink so low as to inform us so little about the arena deal and to be so nasty through Marcus Breton about the people who wanted to vote. But at any rate, I'm seeing that all the candidates I like do not get the B endorsement, so I consider that an endorsement. So we're going to take a short break. We'll come back and hear more ideas from Todd about youthful offenders and whether you prosecute them as grown-ups or as kids. And anyway, we'll hear more about your good ideas, Todd.
Wonderful, thank you.
Ever wonder what makes us, the Smurfs, so happy? The forest, of course! This is where we, along with the beautiful forest creatures, make our home with beautiful plant life, clean water, and endless adventures. It's a place to celebrate. So discover the forest with your family today. Visit discovertheforest.org to find a forest near you.
The next 30 seconds can save you a lot of money. Just do your laundry in cold and stick to full loads. Auto-sleep your computers. Plug your gadgets in a power strip and switch it off when you're done. Headed out? Turn back your thermostat by 10 degrees. And drive sensibly. The more energy you save, the more money you save. Find other great tips at energysaver.gov.
Son, tell him that I've begun to dream of things to come, and tell to look for me. I'm going to find some peace of mind. Wake the sun, wake the sun, wake the sun, wake the sun.
We're back with Soapbox. I'm Jeannie Keltner. I'm talking with Todd Leras, our candidate for the DA. And now we're going to ask him the really hard questions. For example, do you support the death penalty?
No, I don't.
Okay, I'm not voting for you. You're too soft on crime.
Well, let me say this. I've explained in great detail that, number one, I don't think that any candidate can ever say, I won't enforce the law. So I've said, look, the death penalty remains the law. And so on that basis, I have told people that I won't take it off the table completely, but I disfavor it. And I believe that it is on its way out.
So why do you disfavor it?
I've seen how the sausage is made. I was in the homicide unit in the DA's office for 5 years, and I saw the iniquities that can occur between defendants who are similarly situated, and there's just no way to eliminate that. That's one of the primary reasons. It results in a real disparity, and also I think people need to understand that it's really unfair to the victims' families as well, that they think they're getting closure, but the number one cause of death on death row is old age. And so it's going to just keep renewing the removal of the scab on the wound over and over again. When you successfully prosecute a special circumstance murder case, and I have, and you're done, and you can turn to the family and say, look, this person is never getting out. Life without parole. They will die behind bars. They know it's over. They know that the appeal process is going to go on. In about 2 or 3, 4 years, they'll get notice that the appeal has been affirmed. In other words, the conviction's been affirmed. And so they can go on with their lives. They don't even have to worry about getting notices that someone's coming up for a parole hearing, because they're not going to get a parole hearing.
Right.
But in death cases, there are writs, there are appeals, there's direct appeals, there's collateral attacks, there are execution dates that then get stayed. And so you really put those people through the ringer, and I don't think people generally understand that.
Well, certainly some people do, because we have this large movement now of victims' families against the death penalty.
And you know, it's interesting, that was one of the other objections that I had, is it's usually a one-way ratchet in the DA's office, which is if the victim's family comes in and says, we want the death penalty, that is a factor that is really taken into consideration in enforcing the death penalty. But if they say, we really don't, then they're told, well, that's nice, but that's only one factor, and we're going to do what we want because it's our choice. And remember, it isn't just our choice as in the office's choice. The person who makes the decision ultimately is the elected DA. All right? People don't understand that. Early in this process, someone on the opposition side attacked me about this particular issue and said that I had supported a judicial candidate in the past who had come out in favor of the death penalty. Well, both judicial candidates in that race had favored the death penalty, and I had to explain to them, a judge saying I will enforce the death penalty doesn't mean they're going to select the death penalty.
They don't have that choice, do they?
The judge can't tell the DA, you're going to go back and you're going to file this as a death penalty case. The DA can say, that's nice, Judge, no. It's only the DA. So if for no other reason can a DA make a difference, it's on that particular issue.
Well, you know what they say, that the one person who has never been on death row is a rich person.
Well, you see
because it's very rare that a rich person has ever been executed for the most heinous crime.
When I went for the interview with the local newspaper, the Bee, the other day, one of the things that came up was they were talking about the inequities. They asked me about the death penalty, of course. All of us, they asked. But they wanted to know about why I had a problem with it. And I really told them about some of the things that we've talked about, but my main objection is the fact that we have 58 counties in California. And that means we have 58 elected district attorneys and 58 separate policies about when death is going to be selected as an option in a special circumstance case. Not one law. And
So if I want to murder somebody, what county should I murder him in?
I would, if I was going to tell you, I'd go to San Francisco or Alameda or Los Angeles, okay?
I might get off.
Well, you're certainly going to be in a lot better shape than if you do it in Kern County or Riverside or Sacramento.
Okay. So unequal justice.
Yes. And so they said, well, what if that decision was removed from the local DAs? There's been a movement talked about, and you put it in the hands of the Attorney General. And the problem with that still is that the juries are selected at the local level. And it's not just that the DAs in the counties that I mentioned that are more lenient on the death penalty and the counties that are more harsh on the death penalty that make a decision. It's also the jury pools.
Yeah, the populace itself is more conservative.
I went to Berkeley, and I can tell you, I can't imagine prosecuting anyone in Berkeley. I mean, it would be a difficult task, yet alone prosecuting a death penalty case there.
Right.
You're just not going to get a death qualified jury in that community. It's a very liberal community, and people generally oppose it. And so why should your being subjected to the death penalty depend on where you committed your crime? Not what you did,
right,
but where you
did it.
Yeah.
And then we have all these instances of people through late DNA evidence being exonerated, and they've been on death row or they've served 20 years, or we can't be sure that we're convicting the right people.
There is no worse thought, and I've talked about the gravity of the death penalty decision. I've had to make that decision in special circumstance cases before, and there is no weightier and more important decision that anyone could ever be called upon to make, and it should be treated with appropriate gravity.
Right.
And the fact of the matter is that I've said I would follow the law, but I think that people need to understand that means I would treat it with the gravity it deserves. When I talked about seeing how the sausage is made, one of the things that I saw was exactly what you alluded to earlier. There was a kid named Justin Weinberger who committed a horrible crime back when I was in the major crimes unit in the DA's office. He kidnapped and raped an 11-year-old girl from Rancho Cordova. It was a big media case. And his father was ironically, Deputy Attorney General supervising in the Capital Habeas Corpus Division. Wealthy family, well off, well connected. He was not charged with a death penalty offense. Caucasian, and
wealthy.
And so
makes a difference.
There were a lot of people who were critical of that decision. And I was among the people too. I mean, if you're going to have a death penalty, you have to be able to enforce it across the board equally, impartially, and fairly. And you can never eliminate those considerations of wealth and race. My personal view is I've always looked a little bit more harshly upon someone who has every advantage in life.
Of course.
Because my view is, look, you had every reason in the world to succeed in life. You had a supportive family, you had an education, you had material goods, and yet I'm supposed to condemn the person who had nothing and grew up basically with the nickname No Chance because they were born with no chance at the beginning.
Right.
So that's really the fundamental thing.
As inequality grows in the society, the problem only grows.
Exactly.
The one good thing that the Bee did was their article on inequalities. That was just a couple days ago. I was really surprised at what depth they went into. Here's another harder question.
Sure.
I said to you on the break that when I see policemen on their horses or driving around, I always feel like going, "Don't shoot! Don't tase me, bro! Don't beat me up!" We have seen nothing. I do believe it's a fact, I should check this for sure, that more people have been killed by cops in the past year than died in Iraq, than U.S. troops in Iraq. Now that would make 4,000. That seems high. Maybe it seems the whole war.
That does seem high.
Maybe 10 years of the war. But I'll bet we kill. Well, no point in doing numbers with me because I'm an enumerate, and I can't remember a number as it's spoken to me. What is happening that our police, too many of our police, feel justified not in arresting people but in punishing them?
This may be the number one topic that people bring up when you go out into communities here in Sacramento, when you visit particularly communities of color.
Right, that's
the
who
one
gets it.
question. Yeah, the first thing they say is, what are you going to do about officer-involved shootings? What are you going to do about officer-involved shootings? If you're asking why does it seem that there's been an increase, the fact of the matter is that most officers, the vast majority of officers in my experience as a prosecutor, are honest, hardworking, and people who I actually would trust, and trust with your family, trust with making important decisions. But to say that there are no bad apples is amazingly short-sighted. There are, and when I was in the U.S. Attorney's Office, we would prosecute them. Right? We would actually go after officers who broke the law, who did some pretty terrible things to people in the name of exercising
under the
their
color
authority.
of authority.
Exactly. There is not in California at the current time an environment that really gives the idea to the general public that these shootings are reviewed fairly and impartially in every instance. There's a view, and I've heard it over and over again, that the DA is just looking for a way to justify what the officers did. Now, it would be equally wrong for a DA to go in with it saying, I'm going to be looking for a way to try and charge an officer or ruin their career or ruin their lives. I've had the experience, I can tell you, on 2 occasions where I've seen an officer in a situation where, quite honestly, if I were in their shoes, I would have made the decision to use deadly force, and they did not. And in both of those instances, I said, why did you not fire? This person was reaching for a weapon, the weapon was there, they had endangered you, and I got the same response from both of them, very thoughtful people, and I just wanted to humanize them because you need to understand they have a tough beat, they have a tough job. Their number one goal when they go out at the beginning of their shift is to come back to their family safe at the end, and I appreciate that, I respect that.
Right.
They both said, when I asked them the question, I just couldn't live with myself if I wasn't right. And I could see a way that I could do this without shooting. Okay? Those are good officers.
Right.
Those are nice, humane officers.
Right.
But to say we don't have bad apples, we've had 20 years. When's the last time you remember an officer-involved shooting in this county where the DAs didn't review it and say, well, let's really take a close look at this. We might want to consider charges here. Charges may be warranted, or we can't justify this one. It just doesn't happen. The general view of people out in the communities affected by this is that, as I said, there is a bias in favor of the officers.
Well, you could see how the police or the justice system is biased in favor of the officers. But now with the iPhone, and this is, of course, maybe we don't have more criminality on the part of cops, but we have more people with iPhones capturing whatever is going down. And I've seen incredible videos in which the police were exonerated from using force that was obviously over the top. And see, this corrupts the entire justice system because this is the interface between us and you guys.
Well, it takes away the legitimacy. And you could say, there seems to be a conflict. It's interesting because I had to, as I said before, leave a job that I enjoyed doing in order to go after a community service interest that I thought was worth doing. I'm mindful of conflicts a little more. It seems to me that there's an inherent conflict in the DAs, the local DAs, reviewing shootings by local officers.
Right.
We saw that, for example, right now there's a case in Sonoma County, the county where I come from, of a young boy, 12-year-old Andy Lopez. And that case hit me because Andy Lopez was out playing with a toy gun in fields near where I played as a boy with toy guns with my cousins. And a Sonoma County Sheriff's deputy is under investigation right now for shooting him to death. That he says the boy had a very realistic-looking gun that at the end painted black instead of orange, so he couldn't tell if it was real, and he fired and he killed this young boy. The DA over there, Jill Ravitch, is somebody who I've admired from a distance. I think she's a very solid DA. She's up for re-election, and she's done this the right way. She said, I'm going to meet with the officers, I'm going to meet with the families, and I'm going to assign a top person in my office to review this. That's how these things should be treated. And she's going to try to give everyone the feeling that she's considered all the relevant evidence before making a decision. Why is that so hard? It seems that we should be able to do that in Sacramento County as well. And you would think, all right, there's got to be a safeguard then. Well, the AG can be asked to review these things. But we saw a situation in Yolo County a few years ago, actually 5 years ago this week on April 30th, where a man named Luis Gutierrez was walking from DMV. 3 undercover officers from the gang unit approached him. There was an incident, and Mr. Gutierrez ended up at the end of it with a bullet wound. That the entry wound was in his back, the exit wound was in his front.
Bad sign.
And the DA prepared a 37-page report that I reviewed that justified the shooting. And Jeannie, what was shocking about it was the way that report was written. Every inference that could be drawn in favor of what the officers did was drawn in favor of what the officers did. So if any piece of evidence could be picked out to say this was a justifiable shooting, it was.
Right.
And there were significant questions that were unanswered. And the AG, the deputy AG who reviewed that shooting, was Maggie Krell. And she issued a one-page form letter without citing a single fact, a single case, saying this shooting was okay. I've been very critical of that.
With very good reason.
And I will tell you that as an experienced prosecutor who's tried significant murder, rape, child molestation, robbery, domestic violence cases, that the first thing I did when I read it was I said, look, they're relying primarily in Yolo County on a jailhouse snitch. Now, any DA worth their salt, when they see a jailhouse snitch, the first thing they want to know if they're going to cross-examine that person is, what'd they do, what are they asking for, and what corroboration do you have that they're telling you the truth? And this jailhouse snitch in this case, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit because I want to illustrate.
Well, this says something about your opponent that is very distressing.
Well, and I was surprised. I was hoping that we could at least address some of these issues at the United Latino gathering on Saturday, but she showed up before we spoke, took some pictures, and then departed before speaking to that
Maybe
group.
didn't want to speak about that issue.
She should be asked about that. I assume that someone should ask her. I know that I've been present when she's been asked, and I have yet to hear some satisfactory answers about why at least that investigation wasn't kicked back to Yolo County and someone asked these questions of what did the snitch get, what was the snitch charged with.
I didn't hear this. What did the snitch snitched against Gutierrez?
No, what the snitch did was the snitch came in and said, it's a jailhouse informant who said, look, I know Gutierrez, and I knew he went by the nickname of Indio because he threw a knife like an Indian, and I'm surprised these officers are alive. And that statement was used by Yolo County to justify, I mean, it was used extensively to say he was dangerous, the officers needed to protect themselves, the circumstances justified what they did. And the reason I think it's so important to have asked the significant questions is, number one, if there were a nickname of Indio because of this particular reputation, you would think that there would be other witnesses who would be able to come forward and say, yes, I knew him as Indio. I want someone to tell me that. And I'd also want to know, what did you give that person? We still don't know the answers to those questions.
Well, the whole story sounds like it's made up out of whole cloth. I mean, you can call somebody Indio. It doesn't mean that he has a fatal knife-throwing ability, you know, that makes him so dangerous that you have to shoot him in the back.
Well, there was a knife at the scene, and there was DNA from Gutierrez on the knife, to be fair. But obviously, members of the community were concerned about the circumstances since the officers approached Gutierrez first, and he was running from them, and there were witnesses to that, and because of the entry wound, he was shot from behind. There were these questions about whether he had threatened them.
Whether he was a danger to them.
Right. And certainly, if you're going to be fair to both sides, if you are Luis Gutierrez and you're walking from the DMV and you're approached by three burly guys in a high crime area that's subject to gang activity.
And they're undercover.
Yeah, and they're undercover, you might think these are gang members who mean me harm and I've got to run away and I may need to defend myself. So that's why I felt it was unsettled, that there were questions that needed to be answered and weren't. And I think it's the way that report was done, the lack of attention to detail, the lack of a real effort to get to the bottom of things is exactly what people in various communities have complained to me about.
It's why African American and Hispanic and Latino and Vietnamese and Hmong and go down the line, the dark-skinned people of our country do not like law enforcement because they're picked on constantly. They're stopped and frisked. They're stopped for, I have a friend who takes very good care of his car. He's constantly being stopped and they'll say, hey, your tail light is out. Well, come on, I just had that fixed. Let's go look. Click, it goes on. Oh, I guess there must be a short. Just get a fix-it ticket. Okay, he loses a day's work. He has to deal with the police. You know, I mean, it's very hard to feel that there's equal justice in this country. Just as there's wealth inequalities, there's justice inequality.
A couple of weeks ago, I was at an endorsement interview for the Sacramento Observer, a newspaper that's run by the African American community, and they were talking about that same issue. Again, they brought that issue of disparate and unequal enforcement of the law up, and I gave them an example of why the DA sets the tone, and it's from when I was in the DA's office.
Okay.
And let me just tell you this story because it has a punchline to it.
Oh, good. Oh, good.
Which is
we have 5 minutes. So
okay. Well, then I'll get to it quickly.
Make sure we don't miss the punchline.
I had a resisting arrest case where an African American gentleman was beat to a pulp. It was a severe beating. And when you read the report, it said that it was a Sunday morning and there was a suspicious person outside of a closed business, and so the police department responded and came out and saw this gentleman. And when you read the report, it said officer approached, wanted to make contact to see what they were doing, and the subject in the car refused to cooperate and had to be removed from the car by force and resisted and had to be beat into submission. Okay, this is the report. One of the deputy DAs who was working for me because I was in a supervisorial capacity came and said, well, what do you think of this case? And I said, you know, I have questions and I want to know, what was the business? They don't say what the business is, okay? What was the business and what was he doing when they first made contact?
Yes.
Because it makes a big difference. If
yes.
he's walking back and forth, looking in the windows, and it looks like he's maybe casing the place. Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Well, it turns out that the business was a Big O tire store, and this gentleman was sitting in his car with 4 flat tires. That's the punchline, okay? When I heard that, I said, you need to get rid of that case. You need to dismiss that case. Okay, we cannot go forward with that case.
But the awful thing is, he should have never been questioned in a way. You know what I mean? And if he were sitting in a late model BMW and he were white, he probably wouldn't have been questioned. And then the fact he was beaten, he has a case against the police.
He does, and I don't know if he ever pursued it. But one of the reasons why
it takes
DAs
money to pursue a case like that.
It does. Fortunately, there are some very, very good lawyers in our area who handle those kind of cases, like Mark Marin, for example.
Good, yeah, Mark.
But the thing that really stood out about that particular case is that there was a reluctance to do the right thing, to do justice there, because there was this fear spoken out loud about, well, if we dismiss it, then the officers are subject to liability. Well, the DA's response in that situation should be, that's their problem, not our problem.
They are liable.
Exactly.
I mean, right, to beat somebody like that is a criminal offense.
It should never be a consideration for the district attorney to say, I want to shield an officer who's engaged in misconduct from that misconduct.
That should be part of that officer's record, and get a couple of those going, and that officer should leave the force.
That's exactly.
I mean, those are wonderful jobs for people who want to work, you know, in justice, law enforcement, and we shouldn't have people. There are people who lean toward authoritarian positions so that they can express their violence.
It's a sad fact.
It's a fact.
And it's what we talked about, a few bad apples. I mean, it really is a very small number. However, that small number has no business in the force.
You know what happens when you leave an apple that's rotting in the bag? All the other apples around it rot too.
And my officer friends have said the same thing. You would be absolutely pleased to hear private conversations that you have with officers who say, yeah, that guy is a bad cop, I've got no use for him and he should be out. Okay.
I'd love to see a DA who would work on, go to Leras for DA for more info. This is the man we need in the DA's office if we want to see justice for all, and not justice according to your wallet or according to your color or according to your neighborhood. You know, justice has to rain down. What was it, Martin Luther King? Justice rains down like a river from the mountain or something. Justice is something that we all want.
Yes.
You know, the first thing that a kid says against its parents is, that's not fair. Remember, I mean, that shows there's an innate sense of what is fair and what is just.
That's right.
And our legal system needs freshening up. And Todd Leras, I believe, could do it So go to his website and see what you can do to help this man get elected. This is the kind of justice I would like to see. You mentioned Mark Maron. There's going to be a stake down for the homeless. I've got it as a rhyme. May 1 through 3 at 12th and C. So if you want to go look and see some homeless people who have put together, they're from the Sacramento Homeless Organizing Committee, they've put together a gathering of people to meet the homeless people and to see that they're not demons, and that we want to see what we can do to make a society that includes them as well. Next week I'm going to be talking with Ali Cooper, who is running for the 5th District City Council. He's a man who will get justice coming down like a mighty river from the mountain for the people of the 5th District. Let's get some people in office that serve us, not themselves.
Thank you very much.
Todd, it's been great having you here. I want to hold up your sign again because, for example, I can hardly remember anything if I don't see it in print. That's why I can never learn Arabic, because I can't read any of the words, you know. But Todd Leras for District Attorney would be just the person we need to have. Don't forget to tune in to KVMR this Wednesday. And thanks to Tom Pettit and to Vicki Rand, to Greg Popejoy, to Ruthie Jones, and to Marge McCreary, the people who get this show on the road. And always come back to Soapbox, come back for Ali Cooper next week, because people do matter.
To take that test, changes, turn and face the strain, changes, you wanna be a richer man, changes, turn and face the strain, changes, it's gonna have to be a different